We have a number of other talks coming up, so please look at the library calendar on May 12th. Dr. Lena Homburger-Cordia is going to be, May 13th is going to be discussing the history of the Buffalo County Historical Society, and kind of really setting us up at the museum this year. We're doing a lot of different programming and events related to America 250 and kind of interweaving Buffalo County history into that, so that'll be very exciting. And then we have a number of students who are going to be sharing the work that they are completing and the research that they're conducting with us at UNK. In June 10th, Logan Osmera, one of our public history graduate students, is going to be talking about the history of civil defense during Cold War Nebraska, and he's been doing a lot of research into the history of civil defense, particularly in western Nebraska, so that'll be very exciting. And then August 12th, Delaney Tracy, who's another one of our graduate students, a history graduate student, is going to be speaking to the history of the Frank family's businesses. So, a story that we're all certainly probably familiar with is, the story that we tell with the G.W. Frank Museum. But Delaney's going to be bringing some of her training that she got in business school, and looking, actually kind of crunching the numbers and ultimately concluding that the Franks aren't astute business people, as we all kind of know. So that'll be very, very exciting in August. But today, you all have the misfortune of listening to me. I will be discussing, we're going to be talking about the history of, literary history of the Platte River. This month is National Poetry Month, and the Kearney Public Library has been having events all month celebrating National Poetry Month. There's a calendar available at the back of the room where we are also holding events on campus. We have a poetry reading on Thursday night as part of the Reynolds Lecture, or Visiting Writers Lecture Series on campus. And there's a lot of other events throughout the community to commemorate this month, which this is part of. I want to begin by once again thanking the Kearney Public Library. As always, thank you, Christy, for everything that you do, for hosting us here and really being a hub for a lot of what I'm going to be talking about. The power of arts, the power of literature, the power of poetry. This is that space in this community. And some of the people that certainly some of you know that I'll be talking about and sharing today are present in this building, either on our shelves or if nobody's in the room afterwards, if anybody wants to go across the hall. All of the art pieces, the original art pieces that were Don Welch's book covers are on display as a gift from the Welch family. So there's a poetic and artistic legacy all around this building. So as always, thank you to the library. I also want to thank the other kind of keepers of the literary culture here in Nebraska, the Heritage Writers Room in Lincoln, which maintains the Nebraska Authors Database, which is a really rich repository of information on writers, poets, and others who've contributed to the written word in Nebraska. Lorinda Wisey and the Special Collections at the University of Nebraska at Kearney, where we hold the papers of Shirley Bittner, Don Welch, and a wide range of other writers who I will be discussing today. Kearney Creates, because I just saw Chuck walk in, maintaining kind of the encyclopedic database of the writers from the Platte Valley, from Kearney, and others who contributed to this culture. And then very pointedly, because she couldn't be with us today, I want to thank Gail Welch for having a lot of conversations with me about her dad, that she couldn't be with us today. So we're in that season, right, where we all remember the Platte River exists. By and large, we don't really think about it around here, right? We know it's there. We know it's there this time of year. We hear the cranes. We see the tourists. It takes a little extra time to get, a seat at a restaurant. It takes a little bit extra time to get a cup of coffee down at Kit's, because there's folks around the town to look at the birds. We also are in that time of year where we're thinking about what's the snow melt going to look like coming out of Colorado. Is there going to be any water in the river? What's it going to look like? But by and large, the Platte River isn't something that we see, right? We take it for granted. We don't really think about it. We don't spend all that much time. Maybe we go out to the hike-bike trail. Maybe we go out fishing. Maybe we go spend time. Maybe we do go out to a blind first thing in the morning or late at night, looking at the birds. And that is also true of a lot of riders and others who pass through the area, not paying attention to the river, taking it for granted. It's flat, it's muddy, it's nothing, right? And this unseeing of the river, the not seeing of the river, right, is something that a great number of people, though, have tried to counter, who have tried to offer a perspective, a picture, or an appreciation for a resource, as this Worthington Whitridge painting that's just down the street in Pomona. This is from about the 1840s, 1850s. Try to attend to. Now, writers have tried to explain why we don't pay attention to the river. The late naturalist Paul Johnsgard said that there are no towering mountains to lift the spirit, and there are no raging cataracts or waterfalls to overwhelm the ear and eye. Instead, there's a sense of familiarity, of immediate, if superficial, recognition, and a strong sense of association and security, but not of unrestrained excitement or grandeur. We don't think about the Platte River because the Platte River is always there. The Platte River is not exciting. The Platte River is not the mighty Mississippi. Huck Finn is not going down with Jim on a raft. This is not the river that literary epics are made of. But what I want to take us through today is it nevertheless is a river that has been written about time and time again, and will be continuing to be written about time and time again. And I want to begin with someone who didn't see the river, and someone why you might not see the river. And that's Robert Louis Stevenson. Some of you have certainly read Treasure Island, some of you have certainly read Kidnapped. In 1879, he traveled across the United States, traveling via the Union Pacific Railroad, coming through Nebraska. And he tells us in his later recollections of this that are published as Across the Prairie, or Across the Plains in 1892, that we were at sea, but there was no other adequate expression on the plains of Nebraska. I made my observatory on the top of a fruit wagon and sat by the hour upon that perch to spy about me, and to spy in vain for something new. It was a world almost without a feature, an empty sky and empty earth front and back, the line of railways stretching from horizon to horizon like a queue across a billiard board. On either hand, the green plain ran till it touched the skirts of heaven. Now we know that there were people out there. We know that there were things out there, that it wasn't an empty space. We also know that there were new things to look at and see. He's just not seeing the river. We know that Nebraska is more than just undulating plains and sandhills and things. But some of our poets have, again, told us otherwise. Greg Kuzma, in his long poem, Nebraska, tells us that Nebraska's all dirt. Which, okay, I can kind of buy that a little bit. It's what Robert Louis Stevenson is also telling us, right? But when you even dig into that dirt, there's another one of Nebraska's great late poets will tell us, Bill Clefcorn, that punch a thumb into this Platte River Valley soil, and if the thumb is longer than a moment, you'll strike a mother lode far richer even than a good rainwater cistern. Even if you dig down into that dirt, into that nothingness, into that green rolling plain, you're going to find the Platte River. You're going to find the sediments, you're going to find the nutrients, you're going to find eons upon eons upon eons of snowmelt that have come down from the Rocky Mountains and deposited their nutrients on our landscape. But what does it look like when we do a history of the river? What does it look like when we piece together these stories? What is literary history? What does a literary history of the Platte River look like? And so what I'm going to walk you through is the history of the stories, the storytellers, what they recorded, what they saw, and what they want us to see in the landscape around us, the landscape that we take for granted. Now, this isn't a complete literary history. There are going to be some admissions and some navigations and some meandering, because it is the Platte River. Right? It's a braided river. Right? We're going to find some sandbars. We're going to go around. We're going to find some trees that have fallen in. We're going to find a beaver lodge or two, and we might come up on a railroad bridge if we're lucky. But there's a good direction that we can have in understanding what it is. And again, turning to those who have asked us to look at the river much more deeply is really helpful here. And so to someone who we'll turn to repeatedly is Don. And Don tells us in one of his, this is from Gnomes, this is from one of his later collections, if history is a series of rivers, Why do you write about what's on this bank? Notice the way the water intersects itself in your feet. Why do we write about what's on this bank when you can write about what's around your feet? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take Don at his word. We're going to follow the river, and we're going to write not what's on its bank, but we're going to write about, we're going to learn about the water around the feet. But again, we're going to meander, and we're going to go, and I will, for clarification's sake, this is our Platte River, right? The North and the South Platte River that form in the Rocky Mountains in Wyoming and in Colorado, uniting at North Platte, Nebraska, before making their way to Plattsmouth, appropriately Platte's Mouth, right? Very creative. And this touches on a lot of people in the American West. Right? This is a river that meanders through some very large communities, that meanders through some very beautiful country. But this is a talk for Nebraskans in Nebraska, so we're not going to talk about literature from Casper, and we're not going to talk about literature from Greeley. That's another talk. So we're going to talk about how Nebraskans have thought about this space. And they've thought about this space for a very, very long time. This is a William Henry Jackson stereoscope that he produced for the Union Pacific Railroad in the 1860s and 1870s. And William Henry Jackson has a very long life. He dies in the 1940s. And this is a river, again, that has an incredibly deep history. It gives us the name of the state, the Ponca word for flat water, for Platte River, Nebraska, flat water. Or in Pawnee, Kitskasoo, flat water, shallow water. We have these names because of the people who have been on this river for tens of thousands of years, who have told stories, who've created narratives, who have a deeper relationship than we can even imagine. Right? And those are stories. Those are a deep part of the literature of the Platte River, but that's also for another time. Right? We have other names for the river in addition to the indigenous names. The Spanish, the first Spanish military expeditions to come to Nebraska in the 18th century, called it the Rio de Jesus Maria. So its original European name is in Spanish. The French also have a name for the Platte River, and eventually the English have a name, which we call the Platte River. And we're going to follow this river, we're going to do this, we're going to meander through some poems, some novels, some travelogues, and some reflections as we look at this river and its long history. And the river is something, and again, we don't take it for granted, but it's really in the bones of the state. And I'm not the one to tell you that. Another poet is, and that's the late, great Nancy Westerfield, who I know certainly some of you in this room knew. And she writes, Nebraska, a name for the dry riverbed of the old cold ocean, this hollow in the palm of the nation's hand, spanned end to end by a lifeline, a river, one thumbprint of city. Corral it by nighttime, the township sky squared out to frame the land, two lines cleanly drawn, one puzzle cut, for fitting the sky of a notched neighbor, another scalloped river. The great bend of the stars parallels the running glitter of the Platte. Down at rock bottom, the bone of it marrows a hidden river, but where you stand, water and sand, and the thin binding of delicate grasses, netting a basket to catch weather, its weather is the wind. The river is at the heart, at the spine of the state. And we have voluminous tales and narratives and stories about this river. People have been writing about this river, again, for time immemorial. And we have the first kind of large mass of American literature on the river coming in the 1840s with the Oregon Trail. Now, this is Francis Parkman. He's a Harvard-educated historian who, much to the chagrin of his family, decided that in the 1840s he was going to go on a hunting trip out west, and wrote what is kind of the classic account of the Oregon Trail that is still in print to this day. It's a very dated but nevertheless kind of popular text, where he tells us about this river. This is not a river that is dammed. This is not a river that is used for irrigation. This is the Platte that is a mile wide and a foot deep. For league after league, a plain as level as a frozen lake was outspread beneath us. Here and there the Platte, divided into a dozen thread-like sluices, was traversing it. An occasional clump of wood rising in the midst like a shadowy island relieved the monotony of the waste. No living thing was moving throughout the vast landscape except the lizards that darted over the sand and through the rank grass and prickly pear just at our feet. And yet stern and wild associations gave a singular interest to the view, for here each man lives by the strength of his arm and the valor of his heart. Here society is reduced to its original elements. The whole fabric of art and conventionality is struck rudely to pieces, and men find themselves suddenly brought back to the wants and resources of their original natures. He sees the river as a space where you suddenly have to survive on your own. You are away from the city. He's away from the trappings of Harvard. He's away from the trappings of Boston, right? It kind of brings you down to your base nature to survive in an environment like this. Now, others will have a different type of encounter, and we have hundreds of Oregon Trail diaries that describe the river, the difficulty crossing the river, the bodies floating through the river during the cholera outbreaks in 1849. But fairly quickly after this is recorded in 1846, we have a robust infrastructure that you can use to travel around the river. You can take a stagecoach from St. Joseph, Missouri, all the way west by the middle of the Civil War. And there's a young man who had deserted from his Confederate unit and decided to travel west with his older brother, who had been hired as a member of the nascent government of the territory of Nevada. So for $250, they took a stagecoach from St. Joe to Nevada. And he would later tell us about this in Roughing It in 1872, and that young man was Mark Twain. And he describes the Platte River as such. Presently we got underway. We came to the shallow, muddy, yellow muddy South Platte with its low banks and its scattering flat sandbars and pygmy islands, and a melancholy stream straggling through the center of the enormous flat plain, and only saved from being impossible to find with the naked eye by its sentinel rank of scattering trees standing on either bank. The Platte was up, they said, which makes me wish I could see it when it was down, if it could look any sicker and sorrier. They said it was a dangerous stream to cross now because the quicksands were liable to swallow horses, coach, and passengers if an attempt was made to ford it. But the mails had to go, and we made the attempt. Once or twice in midstream, the wheels sunk into the yielding sand so threateningly that we half believed we had dreaded and avoided the sea all our lives to be shipwrecked in a mud wagon in the middle of a desert at last. But we dragged through and sped away towards the setting sun. So we see again the common things that we all think of the Platte River. It's really not that mighty. It's up? Really? It's dangerous? Yeah. It's surprising. It can swallow you up, and it almost takes out Mark Twain. And he will take this journey. He'll move to Nevada. He'll become work for a newspaper and really kind of cut his teeth in the writing that will later make him famous for the remainder of the 19th century and well into the beginning of the 21st century, or 20th century, excuse me. But he's not the only one who's imagining the trials and tribulations of traveling along the Platte River in this time period. But has made this journey. There's another writer, another equally famous writer from this time period, who also makes the journey down the Platte River, but he never steps outside of France. So his Platte River is a little different. And he travels a little differently, mind you. In Jules Verne's Around the World in 80 Days, the party of Phileas Fogg and Passport and their whole retinue have just barely made it to Fort Kearney under attack from a group of Native Americans. They arrive at Fort Kearney and suddenly they don't know how they're going to travel on further. The railroad is not running, but they need to continue their journey if they're going to win the bet of getting around the world in 80 days. So they do what a great many of us do in the wintertime, is we look for a local inventor who has an ice boat, because that makes sense, right? But not just any ice boat, specifically an ice boat that runs on land, right? This is science fiction. But they tell us that they have a sledge with a large sail, that the prairie is frozen and flat. And across that sledge, they will make their way from Kearney to Omaha just by the power of the wind. Now, this is the prairie that has no trees. This is the prairie that is purportedly flat, mind you. This is the prairie that only a Frenchman can envision based on reading somebody else's accounts of the river. But the prairie across which the sledge was moving in a straight line was flat as the sea. Again, has clearly not been to Nebraska. It seemed like a vast frozen lake. The railroad which ran through this section ascended from the southwest to the northwest by Grand Island, Columbus, an important Nebraska town, Schuyler, and Fremont to Omaha. It followed throughout the right bank of the Platte River. The sledge, shortening this route, took a chord of the arc described by the railway. Mudge was not afraid of being stopped by the Platte River because it was frozen. The road then was quite clear of obstacles, and Phineas Fogg had but two things to fear: an accident to the sledge or a change of calm in the wind. Right? So we have science fiction writers who are making epic journeys through the Platte Valley and across the Platte River in a wind-powered sledge in the 1870s, right? That the Platte River that we forget about, the Platte River that we do not care about, is the subject of science fiction. Seems strange and unusual. And writers will continue to return to the river. They will continue to evoke the river, but fewer and far between. And it's going to take another writer to kind of attend to and envision what that river would look like. And that's done by a writer from Virginia who, when she turned 60 in the middle of the Great Depression, produced one last great novel about the prairie. And that's Willa Cather. So Lucy Gayheart, which is set in Haverford, Nebraska, which is, as is typical for Willa, a reimagining of Red Cloud, is not set in the Republican River Valley. It's set on the Platte River. So Haverford, Nebraska, again, which is not one of our vibrant Platte River communities. And the river plays a critical role in this novel about a young woman by the name of Lucy Gayheart who is able to go to Chicago and become a musician. She's able to kind of have a career there, get some training, come back, and through some personal navigations in her personal life, she has her local, a local man declares his love for her. She's got a relationship with somebody else. He dies. She comes back to town. And woven all throughout is the frequency upon which they skate on the frozen Platte River in winter. It's something they do at the beginning of the novel, something they do when they're young, and it's something that Lucy does at the end of the novel. It's the last thing that she does, because she slips through the ice and drowns, and they find her body a couple of weeks later when the river's unfrozen. And so she sees the river as the site of personal tragedy. She sees the community, the changing dynamics of the community in the late 19th to the early 20th century, the changing from kind of a burgeoning, growing community to a settled, kind of typical Midwestern community, and one life that was transformed in that moment, all along the Platte River. And Willa tells us very particularly that she understands the Platte Valley, that there's no air like the Platte Valley, because Denver's too high and Chicago's too low. There are no autumns like ours anywhere. And she knew well the dynamics of the Platte Valley, even though she grew up in the Republican River Valley. She spent her critical years of her life in Red Cloud. She had family here in Kearney. Her brother and sister-in-law and niece and nephew lived here in Kearney, and she would visit them on occasion. They would eventually become the executors of her estate, her niece and nephew. And so she understood. She spent a lot of time in Hastings, too, as a young woman, and understanding the Platte River, spent time in Grand Island, spent time in Lincoln. She knew the river well. Okay. But then there are others who are able to facilitate travel to the Platte River from further away, other novelists who are envisioning and imagining the possibilities. The next generation of writers who will emerge are less interested in kind of the depictions of small town life that Midwestern writers are producing in the early 20th century. These writers are much more interested in kind of destabilizing literature. They're much more interested in kind of confronting the conformity of their era. And the most notable among them is a young gentleman by the name of Jack Kerouac, who spends quite a bit of time in the Platte Valley in his classic On the Road. In the multiple cross-country journeys that make up On the Road that happen in the 1940s and then are later written about in his kind of definitive stream of consciousness style. He spends an entire day in Shelton, which he describes as goddamn Shelton, because he is let off and can't find a ride. And so he just sits by the railroad tracks waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting for somebody to pick him up. He's offered a job at a local carnival that's in town, and I have checked the Shelton paper. There was a carnival in town that day. He declines that job, and eventually does find someone who will take him the rest of the way up Highway 30 up into Cheyenne. And along that journey, he describes the Platte Valley like this. We got a brief ride from a wealthy rancher in a 10-gallon hat who said the valley of the Platte was as great as the Nile Valley of Egypt. And he had said, and as he said so, I saw the great trees in the distance that snaked with the riverbed and the green verdant fields around it, and almost agreed with him. Almost ever the contrarian Jack Kerouac. The Platte Valley's like, okay. Just okay. And he will return through the Platte Valley again in subsequent trips over the road that comprise the novel. But in his second trip over the road, he will be blasting across Highway 30 in the middle of the night. So he doesn't really see the river, unfortunately. It's only at the beginning of the novel that he tells us what the Platte River looks like. And this is a genre-defining novel. The beats, I'm sure a great many of you have read on the road, gone through a beat stage, got a pair of bongos and a beret. And others have wanted to emulate this possibility, this potential, this wandering across the United States. And others have come and found the Platte River that way. Most notably among them is Jacques Poulin, who's a Quebecois author, whose 1984 novel Volkswagen Blues is an intentional evocation of Jack Kerouac's On the Road. It's his search for a lost brother. He has a hitchhiking companion, a young woman who is Matee. And they travel across the American West looking for this lost brother and then intentionally following the Oregon Trail. Eventually making their way onto the Platte River. They leave Independence, they come up through Kansas, they get onto the Platte River, and at North Platte, his traveling companion begins to dream of bison. They're at a campground in North Platte, they've crossed over the river, and she describes it. She sat up in bed and began to talk about the buffalo. At first her words weren't too coherent, but Jack listens patiently. There's a distant hum, she said. You're on the plain, on the shore of a river. Assuredly the Platte River. And you're fixing your lunch when all of a sudden you hear a hum, a muffled sound that gets louder. The first thing that occurs is that there's a storm brewing, and you can see that it's an enormous herd of buffalo. They're making this journey in the late 20th century. They're traveling in a Volkswagen bus. There aren't bison, but they're in that landscape. They're feeling that landscape. They're feeling the history around them, and they begin to dream of bison. And others have this deep, deep connection to the landscape, this connection that is unexplainable when you come into contact with the river. Right? We're all feeling it a little bit this month, again, as the cranes come and go. And this is captured in Richard Powers' National Book Award winning The Echo Maker, which is a complex story about consciousness and identity, mental health, and cranes. Set during the arrival of the cranes, okay, in the early 2000s. It's about a woman whose brother is involved in a car accident down on the river road, substantially injured, and develops he's diagnosed with a condition that he doesn't believe the people around him are who they say they are. And amidst this kind of moment, it kind of fuses with the story of the Sandhill Cranes. And it is the only National Book Award winning novel set in Kearney, so if you haven't read it, I highly recommend reading it. But at the beginning of the book, there's this description as the sister is making her way down from Sioux City, she's making her way to Kearney to find her brother in the hospital after he's been injured, where she's traveling through Grand Island. Outside Grand Island, 200 miles down from Sioux, as the day broke and the sky went peach, she glimpsed the Platte. First light glinted off its muddy brown, calming her. Something caught her eye, bobbing pearl waves flecked with red. Even she thought highway hypnosis at first. A carpet of 4-foot birds spread as far as the distant tree line. She'd seen them every spring for more than 30 years, and still the dancing mass made her jerk the wheel, almost following her brother. Right? We know the cranes come. We see the cranes every year. We hear them. Maybe we go out and see them, but there's still, every time you see them, there's something about it, right? Something that we take for granted, but then when you see it, that Richard wanted to put out here. And that's something that our poets have done a really good job of attending to. In the 1960s and in the 1970s, there was a renaissance within regional poetry, and there was a Midwestern Renaissance. A lot of small presses emerged, a lot of young poets who wanted to write about locality. They wanted to write about the communities around them. They wanted to sink their thumbs into that Platte Valley dirt. And this is happening in Nebraska, and Iowa, and the Dakotas, and Kansas, and elsewhere. And the benefit of that, there are a great many names that come out of this movement, the poets who are attending to these conversations. The Ted Cougers, the great Kuzmas, the Bill Clefcorns, okay? The Nancy Westerfields, Shirley Bittners, Don Welches, Chuck Peake, who are writing about the places around them and asking us to see what they want to see. And Nancy does this. Nancy was a longtime Kearney resident. She and her husband, Hargus Westerfield, a longtime professor at Kearney State College, English professor at Kearney State College, arrived on the morning milk train to Kearney in about 1964. Nancy was a longtime parishioner at St. Luke's Episcopal Church, a very stern acolyte master. I can attest to that personally. Also, and I say this is not hyperbole, the most prolific poet in the history of the state of Nebraska. She published an estimated 700 poems during her lifetime. She published a poem every month from 1968 until about 2004. It's a lot, very prolific. And among them are very deep and rich tales of the Platte River, channeling the Platte. Winter, its scant meander, ice thin, lies in the flat of the land, like a palm of your hand river. Fall, the logos of cottonwoods, all herald yellow, still the shadow, is breeder of its own weather, blue and traces of dusty silver. Beneath the summer shed of a storm, the little parachutes of the rain attack water, that Bible thunderhead scribbles along racers, age-old knower, the river spits back. Spring, naked, unduned, bare bones, but gilt-edged under the brood of its standing cloud, the winged river. The sandhill cranes. She brings us into that moment, that April, that early spring that we all know, that moment that we are in now. And these are writers who, again, are part of a renaissance and a tradition that is really amplifying a lot of the landscape around us. And among them, we also have Shirley Bittner. She was a poet, a farmer. She was an educator at Kearney State College as well. She studied with Don Welch and also produced very evocative descriptions of the river. River on the Platte. Even without leaves, the trees near the river haze, they lean towards one another and plan in whispers to walk out to the highway, to bend a multitude of thumbs and leave the light at work, drying the wet holes, their toes now standing. Sometimes the wind blows and then the old ones lie down heavily, side by side, pioneers pulling pine lids over their eyes. Her master's thesis will talk a lot about the Platte River. The farm they have is in a little knot she describes in the introduction to her master's thesis near the river. And so she will spend a lot of time and a lot of the imagery in her collections. Her two poetry collections are about the river. But the great poet of the river, the one who almost assuredly writes about the Platte River the most and spends the most time in the river, is Shirley's teacher, is Don Welch. He has an entire collection called the Platte River, which this comes from in 1992, but writes and returns to the river repeatedly across his large body of poems. Now at the edge of this river, wade in. The river which grips your ankles is the smoothest chain, yet it still has you. What it asks is the initiation of your skin, your feet given over to drift sand. Look, ahead a small sandbar has risen like an ancient whale, head down, its flukes thrust into land. If you want to know its graver self, walk carefully its taut arch, then take its lead. Step off again. In the shallows you'll find grains of sand which flake like gold, but glad for motes. But go on, so much darker, dive in. The water only wants to involve you. The water only wants to involve you. Now this is something that we don't all do necessarily. I'm sure everyone in this room has probably waded in the Platte River at some time. But probably not recently. It's a little cold. But the river only wants to involve you. And Don was a good guide to the river, again, over his long career as a student at Kearney State College, and then eventually a professor at Kearney State College, and then he retired, and then he became a professor again at Kearney State College, and then he retired, and then became a professor at Kearney State College again. But was the inaugural Reynolds Chair at the university, which has then initiated a long tradition of visiting poets and creative writing students that continues to this day under Brad Model. And he has taken his students, Don has taken his students to the river and continues to take us to the river. And I want to share then one of those encounters with you. In 1987, Kearney State College invited Mary Oliver, the Pulitzer Prize-winning poet, to come and speak to students as part of the National Poetry Festival. The other keynotes were Bill Clefcorn and Ted Kosher, who will later also win a Pulitzer Prize and become the two-time U.S. Poet Laureate. And Mary Oliver tells us that I've read much of the history of the area and well aware of the descriptions of Nebraska written by Marty Sandos and Willa Cather. So she did her research, good job. Really, really happy when she came. And then she tells the students this in the hub, that I'm very eager to see the Platte River, to which, as the hub reports it, drew a few chuckles from the audience. Right? I used to have this idea about drinking out of rivers. Maybe tomorrow I'll go out to the Platte. Is that not a good idea? Now, we don't know whether Mary drank out of the Platte River. I'd like to think she did. But Don did take her to the river. And they did spend time in the river. You know, if you're gonna have a guide to the Platte River, if you're gonna have a poetic guide for the Platte River, there's nobody better than Don. And she saw the river. She understood the river. A river that Don very deeply cared about, a river that Don, his remains were given to the river at the end of his life, a river that he is still in. And Mary returned to the river. It sat with her. That visit sat with her in a very moving essay, Winter Hours. I would say there exist 1,000 unbreakable links between each of us and everything else, and that our dignity and our chances are one. The farthest star in the mud at our feet are a family, and there is no decency or sense in honoring one thing or a few things than closing the list. The pine tree, the leopard, the Platte River, and ourselves, we are at risk together, or we are on our way to sustainable world together. We are each other's destiny. We might not see the river. We might take the river for granted. We might only remember the river in April. But nevertheless, the river is there. The river is part of us, and we are part of that river. We are a part of 1,000 unbreakable links. Don took Mary Oliver down to the river, and she saw the river. It's something that Dawn and Shirley and Nancy and a host of other riders continue to ask us, is to go to the river and to see the river, and in the river, see ourselves and see those around us. Thank you. And just because I'm always an educator, I do have a list of all the books I referenced. And all of them, I think except for Volkswagen Blues, are downstairs. So if you have a library card, please go downstairs and get some reading material for the weekend. So I do have those. But I will happily answer